The fluorescent lights hummed like dying wasps above Eddie's head as he pressed the ballpoint pen against yellowed prison stationery, his knuckles white with the effort of keeping his hand steady. The smell of industrial bleach couldn't mask the undertones of sweat and fear that permeated death row, a cocktail of human desperation that had seeped into the concrete walls over decades. Outside his 8 by 10 cell, a guard's boots clicked against the polished floor in a rhythm that matched the seconds ticking away on the wall clock. 11 hours, 14 minutes until they'd strap him to the gurney. Eddie had written exactly 7 words when he heard it, a sound so faint it could have been his imagination, but his trained ear caught it anyway, the distant rumble of a Vietwin engine, somewhere beyond the prison walls. Stay with me on this one. Eddie Morrison had spent the last 3 years in this cage, convicted of killing a rival club member in a bar fight gone wrong. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer, another violent biker who'd finally gone too far. They showed the jury his tattoos, the skulls, the flames, the club patches he'd earned over 20 years riding with the Devil's Disciples. They talked about his record, bar fights and assault charges stretching back to when he was 19. What they didn't talk about was the knife the other guy pulled first, or the 3 witnesses who mysteriously decided not to testify, or the fact that Eddie had been defending a kid who'd wandered into the wrong bar at the wrong time. The letter in front of him wasn't addressed to his lawyer or his family. He'd said his goodbyes already. His sister had visited last week, crying behind the scratched plexiglass while he tried to make jokes about the prison food. His mother had passed 2 winters ago, never lived to see him in chains. The old man had disappeared when Eddie was 12, left nothing behind but an empty whiskey bottle and a rusted Harley-Davidson in the garage that wouldn't start. No, this letter was for someone else entirely, someone who owed him nothing but who might be the only person left who'd understand why it mattered. He thought back to that night 3 years ago, the way the neon beer signs had cast everything in reds and blues like some twisted American flag. The broken spoke wasn't neutral territory. Everyone knew it belonged to the Savage Souls, had for going on 15 years. But Eddie had been passing through, just wanted a cold beer after a long ride from Bakersfield. The desert had left grit in his teeth and his throat feeling like sandpaper. He should have kept riding, found somewhere else to wet his whistle. Should have, could have, would have, the 3 horsemen of regret that visited him every night in his cell. The kid couldn't have been more than 18, wearing a leather jacket that was too new, too clean. College boy playing dress-up, probably thought walking into a biker bar would make a good story for his frat brothers. Eddie had been nursing his beer at the bar, minding his own business, when he heard the commotion start. 3 savage souls had surrounded the kid, were giving him the kind of attention that usually ended with someone spitting teeth. The smart play would have been to finish his beer and walk out. Let the kid learn his lesson about wandering into places he didn't belong. But something about the boy's eyes, wide with the realization that he'd made a potentially fatal mistake, reminded Eddie of someone. Maybe himself at that age, before he'd learned to hide fear behind a sneer and a clenched fist. Maybe his nephew, his sister's boy, who was about the same age and just as naive about how cruel the world could be. Whatever it was, Eddie found himself standing up from his bar stool, found himself walking over to where the savage souls had formed a semicircle around their prey. "Kids with me," he'd said, the lie rolling off his tongue smooth as aged whiskey. The biggest of the 3, Tank, they called him, on account of both his size and his stint in the army, had turned to face Eddie, recognition flickering in his bloodshot eyes. They knew each other by reputation, if not personally. Different clubs, but they'd crossed paths at rallies, runs, the occasional neutral meeting ground where club business got discussed without colors flying. "Devil's Disciples got no business here, Eddie," Tank had said, his voice a low rumble like thunder before a storm. "This ain't your territory and this sure as hell ain't your boy." The smart play, there it was again, that notion of what he should have done would have been to apologize for the misunderstanding and leave. But the kid was shaking now, trying to hold it together but failing, and Eddie had already committed to the lie. Once you start down a road, his old sergeant-at-arms used to say, you better be prepared to ride it to the end. "Tonight he is," Eddie replied, keeping his voice level steady. Boy's my cousin's kid, doesn't know any better. Let me get him out of here, and we'll call it square. The letter on the metal desk in front of him was getting harder to write. His hand had started cramping, and the words weren't coming out right. How did you explain to someone who'd never been there what it meant to stand up for a stranger? How did you make them understand that sometimes the code you lived by mattered more than living itself? The guard walked by again, glanced through the bars with the practiced disinterest of someone who'd watched too many men count down their final hours. Tank had laughed that night, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. More like a hyena spotting wounded prey. Your cousin's kid, huh? Funny, I don't remember any devil's disciples having family this far north. He'd taken a step closer, close enough that Eddie could smell the mixture of beer and menace on his breath. Tell you what, Eddie. You want to claim this little rabbit, you can claim the consequences too. That's when Eddie saw the knife. Tank was good, kept it low and hidden from most angles, but Eddie had been in too many fights not to recognize the subtle shift in stance, the way Tank's right hand stayed too still while the rest of him stayed loose. The kid might have thought they were just going to rough him up, maybe break his nose and send him running. But that knife changed everything. Dead college boys brought heat, the kind of attention no club wanted. Let's take this outside, Eddie had suggested, nodding toward the back exit. No need to bleed all over Mickey's floor. Mickey was the owner, an old-timer who'd lost his leg in Vietnam and didn't have patience for people making messes in his establishment. Tank had grinned, gold tooth catching the neon light. After you, brother. The thing about bar fights, the real ones, not the Hollywood versions, is they're usually over in seconds. All that choreographed back and forth was movie nonsense. Real violence was quick, brutal, and usually ended with someone wondering how they'd gotten from vertical to horizontal so fast. But as Eddie led the way to the back alley, he wasn't thinking about winning or losing. He was thinking about that knife and what Tank planned to do with it. The alley smelled like rotting garbage and piss, the perfume of every back alley in every rundown part of America. A single bulb above the back door cast everything in harsh shadows, making monsters out of dumpsters and doorways. The kid had tried to follow them out, but Eddie had turned, put a hand on his chest. You get on your bike and ride, he'd told him. Don't stop until you hit the interstate. But now, looking back, locked in the cell with nothing but time to replay every second, Eddie wondered if the kid ever made it home. Wondered if he told his friends about the night he almost died, or if he kept it to himself, a secret reminder of how thin the line was between breathing and not. Wondered if he ever thought about the biker who'd stood between him and three men who'd have hurt him just for the fun of it. The pen in Eddie's hand kept moving across the paper, even though his thoughts were 3 years in the past. He'd never been much of a writer, dropped out of high school at 16 to work at a garage, spent more time with a wrench in his hand than a pencil. But tonight, with less than 11 hours left on his personal clock, the words seemed important. Like if he didn't get them down now, they'd die with him, and somehow that seemed worse than dying itself. Tank had come at him fast the moment they were outside, faster than a man his size had any right to move. But Eddie had been expecting it, had already shifted his weight, already brought his boot up to meet Tank's knee. The bigger man stumbled, cursing, and that's when the knife came out for real, 6 inches of sharp steel gleaming under the yellow bulb. Should have minded your own business, Eddie, Tank growled, circling now looking for an opening. His two buddies had spread out, flanking Eddie, but they seemed content to watch for now. This was Tank's show, his reputation on the line. Devil's disciples always did think they were better than everyone else. Eddie kept his hands up, kept moving, kept his eyes on that knife. He'd been cut before, had a scar along his ribs from a run-in with some wannabes in Oakland, and he knew the secret was not to think about it. The moment you started worrying about getting cut was the moment you froze up, and freezing up was a good way to end up bleeding out in an alley that smelled like piss. Just protecting a kid, Eddie said, buying time looking for his moment. Didn't know the savage souls had started hunting children. That got to Tank, made him lunge when he should have fainted. Eddie grabbed his knife hand at the wrist, used Tank's own momentum to drive him face first into the brick wall. There was a wet crunch, Tank's nose breaking, and then they were grappling for the knife, all technique forgotten in the primal struggle to control 6 inches of sharpened steel. This was the part the prosecution had focused on during the trial. The medical examiner testified that Tank had been stabbed 4 times, twice in the abdomen, once in the chest, once in the neck. They made it sound deliberate, methodical. Like Eddie had time to think about each thrust, to choose his targets. They didn't understand, or didn't care, that when 2 men fight over a knife in a dark alley, conscious thought goes out the window. There's only instinct, adrenaline, and the desperate need to be the one still breathing when it's over. Tank's blood had been hot on Eddie's hands, hot and slippery, and more than he'd ever seen come out of one person. The big man had dropped to his knees, then to his side, making sounds that haunted Eddie's dreams even now. Sounds a human throat shouldn't be able to make. His 2 buddies had run. Loyalty only went so far when arterial spray was involved. And Eddie had stood there, covered in another man's blood, knowing that everything had just changed. He could have run too. Could have gotten on his bike and disappeared into the network of safe houses and friendly clubhouses that stretched across the country like an underground railroad for outlaws. The devil's disciples would have helped him vanish. It wouldn't have been the first time, wouldn't have been the last. But he'd stayed. Called 911 himself, tried to keep pressure on Tank's wounds even though they both knew it was too late. Why? Tank had asked, blood bubbling on his lips. Why'd you stay? Because I'm not you, Eddie had answered, and he'd meant it. The code he lived by, the real code, not the one movies and TV shows pretended bikers followed, said you owned your actions. You stood up when it was time to stand up, and you faced the music when the dancing was done. The trial had been a foregone conclusion. Eddie's lawyer, a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, had tried to argue self-defense. But Tank's knife had mysteriously disappeared from the scene. His buddies must have circled back for it, and without it, all the jury saw was a biker with a violent history who'd stabbed an unarmed man in an alley. The fact that Eddie had called for help, had tried to save Tank's life, that counted for nothing. The judge had called him a menace to society and handed down the death penalty like he was ordering lunch. 3 years of appeals had gone nowhere. 3 years of lawyers in cheap suits telling him they were exploring every option while their eyes said they'd already written him off. 3 years of watching the seasons change through a window the size of a shoebox, marking time, until the state of California decided he'd marked enough. The letter was almost finished now. Eddie had never been one for fancy words or flowery sentiment, but he tried to say what needed saying. Tried to explain why he'd done what he'd done, why he'd stayed when he could have run, why some things mattered more than living to see another sunrise. The person he was writing to would understand, or at least he hoped they would. That's when he heard it again, that sound that had caught his attention earlier. Not just one V-twin engine now, but several. Many. The rumble was growing, like distant thunder rolling in from the desert. The guard heard it too, stopped his pacing to cock his head and listen. Even here, buried in the concrete heart of the prison, the sound was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to listen for. Harleys. Lots of them. Eddie set down his pen and moved to the small window, had to stand on his toes to see out. The prison sat on a hill overlooking the valley, surrounded by double fences topped with razor wire that gleamed like deadly tinsel in the security lights. The parking lot beyond was mostly empty, just a few cars belonging to the night shift guards and staff. But on the access road leading up from the highway, Eddie could see lights. Headlights. Single headlights in a long, winding procession, like a river of fire flowing uphill. What the hell, the guard muttered, moving to a window further down the corridor. More guards were appearing now, drawn by the growing roar of engines. Even through the thick walls and bulletproof glass, the sound was becoming overwhelming. Not aggressive or threatening, just present. Undeniable. Like the heartbeat of some massive creature stirring to life. Eddie knew what it was before his mind fully processed what he was seeing. Knew it in his bones, in the part of him that had spent 20 years feeling the rumble of a Harley between his legs, the part that understood brotherhood in ways people who'd never worn a patch couldn't fathom. They were coming. Not to break him out. This wasn't some movie where bikers stormed a prison and rode off into the sunset. They were coming to be present, to stand vigil, to let him know that he wouldn't face his last dawn alone. The first bikes reached the parking lot, their riders dismounting in practiced unison. In the harsh security lights, Eddie could see their patches, could read the rockers that declared their allegiances. Devil's disciples, of course, his own brothers, the men he'd ridden with for 2 decades. But there were others too. Mongols, Vagos, Hell's Angels. Even and this made Eddie's throat tight, a contingent of savage souls, Tank's old club. They kept coming. Bike after bike, rider after rider, until the parking lot overflowed and they began lining the access road. The guards were scrambling now, making phone calls probably to the warden, maybe to the state police. But the bikers weren't doing anything illegal. They were just parking, just standing, just being there. Eddie recognized some of them, even from this distance. There was Big Mike, who taught him to rebuild a shovelhead engine when he was 19. There was Cisco, who'd stood beside him when he'd earned his full patch, who'd bought him his first beer as a fully patched member. There was Even, and this hit Eddie like a physical blow, his old road captain Butch, who'd supposedly been in hiding down in Mexico after that thing with the federal witness. But it wasn't just club members. As Eddie watched, regular citizens began arriving too. Bikes of all makes and models, not just Harleys. Weekend riders on Hondas and Yamahas. Kids on sport bikes. Old-timers on gold wings. They came in groups and alone, adding their presence to the growing mass of chrome and leather gathered outside the prison walls. The guard who'd been pacing earlier appeared at Eddie's cell door, keys jangling. "Morrison, warden wants to see you." Eddie had been to the warden's office exactly twice in 3 years, once when he'd first arrived, once when his final appeal had been denied. Both times he'd been in full shackles, surrounded by guards like he might suddenly develop superpowers and blast through the walls. This time they still cuffed him, but there was something different in the guards' eyes. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty. Like the world had shifted slightly off its axis, and they weren't sure which way was up anymore. The warden's office had a better view of the parking lot, and through the large windows, Eddie could see the full scope of what was happening. There had to be 800 bikes down there now, maybe more. They were organized, not military precision, but the kind of order that came from people who'd ridden together before, who understood how to share space without words. Some had brought camping chairs, were sitting in small groups. Others stood by their bikes, arms crossed, faces turned toward the prison. "You want to explain this, Morrison?" The warden was a thin man with the perpetual frown of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. Tonight, though, he looked more confused than angry. "Can't say I was expecting it," Eddie replied honestly. "I wrote one letter." "That's all? To who?" Eddie almost smiled. "Someone who understands what brotherhood means." The warden stared at him for a long moment, then gestured to the window. "We've got state police 20 minutes out. Highway Patrol is setting up roadblocks to stop more from coming. The governor's office is asking if we need the National Guard." He paused, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I need to know if this is going to turn violent." Eddie looked out at the sea of bikes and riders, at the men and women who dropped everything to be here in his final hours. Some of them had ridden hundreds of miles. Some had probably risked arrest just by showing up. Outstanding warrants were as common as tattoos in some clubs. But they'd come anyway. "No violence," Eddie said quietly. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" "How to explain. How to make a man who'd spent his career behind walls and regulations understand what it meant to belong to something bigger than yourself." Eddie had tried to put it in the letter, but even now, seeing it made manifest in chrome and steel and flesh, he struggled for the right words. "You ever been in the military, warden?" The man nodded slowly. "Marines. To tour in Desert Storm. Then maybe you understand. When one of yours is in trouble, you show up. Doesn't matter if it's convenient. Doesn't matter if they're guilty or innocent. Doesn't matter if you can actually help. You show up because that's what you do. That's what separates brotherhood from everything else. The warden turned back to the window. More bikes were arriving, despite the roadblocks. They were parking on the sides of the highway now, walking the rest of the way. Local news vans had appeared, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal prayers. "The letter you wrote," the warden said. "Who did you send it to?" Eddie thought about lying, but there didn't seem to be much point. In a few hours, it wouldn't matter anyway. "Sarah Chen. She runs a halfway house in Oakland, helps guys getting out of the life find legitimate work." The warden's eyebrows rose. "And she organized all this?" "No," Eddie shook his head. "She just understood what needed to be said and who needed to hear it. The truth was more complex than that. Sarah had never been a biker herself, but her father had been, an old-school writer who'd helped found one of the first chapters of the Dragon Lords back in the 60s. She'd grown up around the culture, understood its rhythms and rituals, its unspoken codes and fierce loyalties. When her father died, she'd inherited not just his house but his Rolodex, names and numbers of writers from a dozen different clubs, men who'd respected her father and, by extension, her. Eddie had met her 5 years ago, before Tank, before the trial, before everything went to hell. She'd been trying to help a young prospect who'd gotten in over his head with drugs, wanted out but didn't know how to leave without ending up in a ditch. Eddie had vouched for the kid, helped arrange safe passage to a new life in Colorado. It was a small thing, the kind of favor writers did for each other when the cause was right. But Sarah had remembered. So when Eddie sat down to write his last letter, she was the one he'd chosen. Not to ask for anything, what could anyone do for a dead man walking, but to tell someone who'd understand why he'd made the choices he had. Why he'd stood up for a stranger. Why he'd stayed when he could have run. Why honor mattered more than life when life was all you had to give. What he hadn't expected was for her to share the letter. To pick up her father's old phone and start making calls. To remind a community that had fragmented into rival clubs and territorial disputes that they all came from the same tradition, all shared the same road in the end. "I need you back in your cell," the warden said finally. "We've got protocols for executions, and 1,000 bikers don't change that." Eddie nodded. He'd seen what he needed to see. As the guards prepared to escort him back, he took one last look at the gathering below. They'd formed a rough circle now, bikes facing inward like wagons in the Old West. Someone had lit a bonfire in a metal drum, probably illegal, definitely against regulations, but the authorities had bigger concerns than a little warmth on a cold night. Back in his cell, Eddie could hear the rumble of engines like a constant heartbeat. New arrivals were still trickling in, would probably continue until dawn. His execution was scheduled for 6 a.m. California liked to get its killing done early, before the rest of the world was fully awake. 4 hours left. He picked up the letter he'd been writing, read through what he'd managed to get down. It seemed inadequate now, seeing the response it had generated. How did you thank people for remembering you existed? How did you acknowledge a gesture that asked nothing but gave everything? Through his small window, he could see riders moving around the bonfire, their shadows dancing on the pavement. Someone had brought a guitar. He could hear it faintly, an old Stones song that every biker knew by heart. Others were talking, sharing stories probably, the way riders did when they gathered. Stories about close calls and long rides, about brothers lost and found, about the freedom of the open road and the price it sometimes demanded. Eddie had his own stories. 20 years' worth, gathered on highways and in clubhouses across the country. The time he'd ridden through a Kansas tornado, because stopping would have been worse. The night 5 clubs had put aside their beefs to search for a missing kid, found her scared but safe in an abandoned barn. The wedding in Sturgis, where 200 bikers had served as honor guard for a brother marrying his high school sweetheart. The funeral in Tucson, where they'd buried a founding member with his bike, sending them both to whatever highway waited beyond. He'd never have the chance to tell those stories again, but maybe that was okay. Maybe they lived better in the telling by others, passed from rider to rider like sacred texts of a religion that worshipped freedom and brotherhood in equal measure. Maybe that's what was happening down in that parking lot right now. His story joining the constellation of stories that made up the culture, becoming part of something larger than his individual life or death. A different guard appeared at his cell, Rodriguez, one of the few who'd ever treated Eddie like a human being instead of a monster. "Thought you might want to know," Rodriguez said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Counts up over 1,000 now. They're saying it's the largest gathering of bikers in the state's history." Eddie felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized was there. 1,000 people who'd never met him, or had met him only in passing, had come to stand vigil at his execution. Not because they thought he was innocent, most probably assumed he was guilty as charged. Not because they could save him, that ship had sailed with his final appeal. They'd come because one of their own was facing the ultimate sanction, and he shouldn't face it alone. "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "That kid, the one from the bar. He's here. Saw him talking to some reporters earlier. He's telling everyone what really happened that night, how you saved his life. The kid." Eddie had wondered about him, hoped he'd made something of his second chance. "What's his name?" "David something. Pre-law student at Berkeley. Says he spent 3 years trying to find witnesses, trying to get someone to listen." Rodriguez shook his head. "Too little too late, but he's trying, pre-law." Eddie almost laughed. The kid he'd saved from getting stomped in a biker bar was going to be a lawyer. There was some kind of cosmic joke in that, though he couldn't quite figure out the punchline. Maybe the kid would be a better lawyer than the one Eddie had gotten. Maybe he'd save someone else down the line, balance the scales a little. "One more thing," Rodriguez said, pulling a small transistor radio from his pocket. "Thought you might want to listen. They're broadcasting from down there. It was against regulations. Inmates weren't supposed to have radios, but Rodriguez set it on the bars and walked away, giving Eddie the closest thing to privacy death row allowed. Eddie tuned it to the local station, heard the DJ's voice crackling through the small speaker. "Unprecedented scene here at Corcoran State Prison, where over 1,000 motorcycle riders have gathered for an all-night vigil. We're here with Sarah Chen, who apparently organized this gathering. Ms. Chen, can you tell us why all these people are here?" Sarah's voice was exactly as Eddie remembered it, calm, thoughtful, carrying an undertone of steel. "They're here because a man is going to die in a few hours, and he shouldn't die alone. They're here because Eddie Morrison stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves, and that means something in our community. But Mr. Morrison was convicted of murder. He killed a man. He defended himself and an innocent kid against 3 armed assailants. The system failed Eddie Morrison, but his brothers and sisters haven't. Some people are calling this an intimidation tactic, a threat against law enforcement." Eddie could practically hear Sarah's eyes rolling. "Look around. Do you see anyone threatening anybody? These people rode hundreds of miles to stand quietly in a parking lot. They're not here to intimidate. They're here to remember, to witness, to make sure that when the state of California kills Eddie Morrison, they do it knowing that he mattered, that his life had value, that he'll be missed." The interview continued, but Eddie turned the volume down. He didn't need to hear more. Sarah had said what needed saying, just like she'd shared what needed sharing when she'd received his letter. She'd understood what he couldn't quite articulate, that dying alone was worse than dying itself, that erasure was the final insult added to the injury of execution. He thought about Tank, dying in that alley with his blood soaking into asphalt that had absorbed so much blood over the years, it was probably more DNA than tar. Tank had died badly, but he hadn't died alone. Eddie had been there, hands pressed to wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, offering what comfort an enemy could give. It hadn't been enough to save him, but maybe it had been enough to make the passing a little less cold. Now Eddie would have his own passing, sanitized and scheduled, witnessed by a handful of officials who'd watch him die with the same dispassion they'd bring to filling out paperwork. But beyond the walls, beyond the razor wire and guard towers, over 1,000 people would be keeping their own vigil. When the drug stopped his heart, their engines would roar in salute.